Welcome to our program today, Narwhal Biology and a Tusk with a Twist with Dr. Martin Nguyen. I'm Jane Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art and Nature Center and Coordinating Curator for Narwhal, Revealing an Arctic Legend. Today's presentation is being offered in conjunction with the traveling exhibition from CITES, the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service, in collaboration with the National Museum of Natural History. And I want to give a special welcome to the project director for the Narwhal exhibition at CITES, that's Carol Bossert. If you would wave your hand, who's joining us today from Washington. And also to welcome Pamela Peters, Dr. Nguyen's wife, and the director of the Institute for a Sustainable Planet. Pamela will actually be coming back here in April to do an Eco Heroes program over school vacation week, which we're very excited about. Dr. Martin Nguyen has been called a modern Renaissance man, and for good reason. He has doctorate degrees in dental medicine and surgery, a full-time dental practice in Connecticut, and degrees in English and biology. He is also a lecturer at Harvard School of Dental Medicine and assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Dental Medicine, as well as a research associate at the Canadian Museum of Nature and the Smithsonian Institution. He is also a global fellow at the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center for International Scholars. This is just part of what he does. His insatiable curiosity and particular passion for narwhals has led him to be one of the, if not the, leading authority on the narwhal's amazing tusk. He has been studying narwhals for 24 years and has participated in over 20 high Arctic expeditions in Greenland and Eastern Canada, where he has been part of a scientific teams with Inuit collaborators and others. His work has received 3 Fulbright Hays Awards, and he was chosen for Canada's 150th anniversary to represent the best example of collaborative science between Canada and the US. Nguyen's narwhal research has been covered widely, including on the cover of the Science Times, New York Times, and on Public Radio International. His work has also been featured in multiple documentaries, including the National Geographic, the BBC with Sir David Attenborough, and Découvert French Discovery. What distinguishes Nguyen's work is his deep-seated passion for the whale at the center of his work and the Inuit people of Canada, who have been with him on this journey from the beginning. Nguyen has funded Canadian and Greenlandic Inuit to attend research forums around the world, telling the story of the narwhal and collaborative research through their eyes. Nguyen was a contributing curator for the Narwhal Revealing an Arctic Legend exhibition at the Smithsonian and a co-editor for the show's companion volume, which was awarded the William Mills Prize, given every 2 years for the best nonfiction polar book. The popular exhibition at the National Museum of Natural History was converted into the traveling version that is here now at PEM. And following the program, Nguyen will be available to sign copies of Narwhal Revealing an Arctic Legend and the inspiring graphic novel Transformed by a Tusk. So without further ado, please join me in giving Martin Nguyen a warm welcome to PEM.
Okay, let's get started. First, I wanted to thank you all from the PEM community here and family for this wonderful welcome. Linda Hardigan, your director, Janie for the kind introduction, Leela Clausen-Miller for the welcome as well. And you know, the star of this show is the narwhal. And if we were giving some kind of award for the presentation, obviously there would be lots of people to thank. So the first people I would thank are the co-curators with this exhibit, Dr. William Fitzhugh, who's head of the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian, and Dr. Marianne Marcoux, who's the Arctic Project leader and research scientist for the Arctic Division of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. Second to obviously Carol Bossert, who has been recognized already for her wonderful leadership in this exhibit, as well as the exhibit's team at the Smithsonian when we originally did this. They followed an interesting lead about bringing Inuit people down for the very exhibit meetings that we had, which I think is of incredible benefit to this exhibit. Now, the other people I would like to thank are the families at Harvard, and today I was surprised by a visit from Dr. Peter Hauschka. If you could wave your hand, please. His garage, and above the garage, which was a workshop, turned out into the Narwhal Annex, where we built some of the original procedures to test on the narwhal, including a Tusk gasket, which was designed, and also floating laboratories, because you wonder, how do you collect medical information in the middle of 36-degree Arctic water? Peter had all the machinery and brains and knowledge to be able to help formulate a lot of these floating laboratories and the gasket that you're going to see a little bit later on. Other places to thank are Case Western Reserve, and particularly the Interactive Commons, for what you will see later as the first interactive and augmented reality program narrated by Meryl Streep, which was also debuted at the Smithsonian. We just came back from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, where it was debuted there. So want to send a shout out to the dental school in Cleveland, as well as the Interactive Commons, which helped formulate this. Let me get my clicker. So for those of you familiar with the Explorers Club flag, I thought this was one of the most unusual places where an Explorers flag could be displayed on the back of a narwhal. I think that's the first time a flag has ever appeared on there. You'll see also in that plastic bag above is a halter appliance. So for those of you who have worn one or know a relative who has, that is indeed how I ended up collecting the heart data, which we went through plenty of iterations before we found the right mechanism. But to really appreciate this animal, we're going to run a video here from the BBC. This was one of the programs they did on the narwhal, because I think you should see it swimming just for a minute or two to appreciate it. If we can roll that.
Known as the Arctic
Might be some sound with it too if you want to.
Strange spiral tusks. Narwhal are some of the most secretive and elusive animals in the world's oceans. The leads provide passage for thousands of these mysterious whales. Each summer they travel 600 miles north, navigating through the ice to reach rich fishing grounds. More whales travel along the edge of the ice where it meets the open sea to search for the openings of leads. It's a hazardous journey. As mammals, they need air to breathe, and if the ice closes above them, they could suffocate.
So the interesting thing about narwhal, which I think attracts so many people other than the animal itself, is there are so many entries into the discovery of this animal. And one of them certainly is the unicorn, whose legendary tusk was thought to be the narwhal. And in this famous diagram by James Houston, who, as you may know, was a very prolific sculpture artist for Steuben glass, also was very artistic in terms of his graphic design. This is one of them that we have exclusive permission to use. And so we can think about some of the most heralded art pieces on the planet. This is from a series of tapestries, Flemish tapestries in the Cluny Museum in Paris called The Lady and the Unicorn. And comparable to that are a series from the Cloisters Museum at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is The Hunt of the Unicorn. And these are some of the most prized possessions in both of those collections. And part of the prize is that even at such an early date when these tapestries were made, there are even metallic fibers. And naturally, the tusk, at this particular point, 15th, 16th century, lots of kings were worried about being poisoned. And it was legend that a little bit of narwhal tusk in your wine would keep you from ever having that fate. So this little boat that you see on the right was from King Carl Gustaf V of Denmark, who had that little boat floating in his goblet of wine. That's made of narwhal tusk. The throne that he had commissioned, also on your left, is also made of narwhal tusk. The Inuit also have their legend. This is the legend of the narwhal. I'm not going to go into it in great depth because it's a very long, complicated story, but suffice it to say that beluga was legend to be the original source, and later from a story of a woman who treated her son very poorly, ended up getting tossed in the water as a karmic relationship back, and apparently her twisted hair formed the tusk. So this is a legend that's all through the Arctic. And this is the Inuit calendar. Now, interestingly enough, when we think about how we devise numbers and calendars, really when you start to think about it on a level as a parent to one of your children or as a teacher to your students, you start to think that everything is kind of arbitrary, right? I mean, alphabet could be completely different, organized. It doesn't have to be ABC, it could be Q, F, W. And indeed, the calendar has been perceived in many cultures in very different ways. This is a 6-season calendar. It's based on sun and moon. It's based on star relationships. It's based on ice and water relationship. And it's also based on animal migrations. So if these patterns change, that calendar is flexible enough to alter any of these variables into a better understanding of what's going on. This is their way to understand their year and how nature responds to it. So this is where we typically go to see narwhal. I've been both in the high Greenlandic Arctic, Qaanaaq, you see on the top there. So all of pretty much western Greenland up from this area of Huna Island that you see on the bottom in a red circled star there. And then Baffin Island, which actually has a little bit higher population. So Arctic Bay is really the primary place where most of these whales can be spotted today. And indeed, they migrate from their southern pack ice, and then during the summer months, when these inlets that you see along both coasts become ice-free, the whales can migrate in there, and that's where the great buffet is in the spring. So they're eating to their heart's content, and when that pack ice forms, or the inlet ice forms again in the late fall, now with climate change, those seasons are a little bit mired, so it can be a little bit later. Then the whales move back down into Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay. The scenery is just incredible. For those of you who are interested in nature or rock climbing, these are some of the most pristine areas. This is from Bylot Island. You're looking at it from Pond Inlet, which is one of the towns. This is pretty much regarded as a nature preserve. You're not allowed to visit without specific permission. We got to go just because we were with Inuit who said, come along. So we got to see these in closer relationship. But for those of you who appreciate places like the Grand Tetons in America, you can imagine miles and miles of stretch of Grand Tetons to give you some comparison. This is also a video. We'll run this. So as most of you know, while the planet is changing and while ice is changing, a lot of the animal migration patterns are also changing with it. The best insight I ever got was from an Inuit who said, narwhal will go where the food is. They're smart mammals, they'll figure it out, but naturally ice-covered areas and the lack of ice over the years have set off a different kind of migration pattern. And we started studying this with a lot of the Inuit elders to better understand where we might see narwhal and how they're being affected by all these changes. These are the people. A lot of information in those lines of the face, right? Very much a quiet, inner people. You have to earn their respect to get the information that you should want and need to get any insight. These are the people that have saved countless explorers who have gone up here thinking that they had a better way of understanding these environments, and these are the people that typically rescued them. Still using a lot of the skins. Interestingly enough, if you put sealskin boots on and you stuck your foot in a puddle of ice cold water, you could leave your foot there for probably a few hours and nothing would happen. So these skins are invaluable. That's caribou that he's wearing on the outside. And this is the amazing animal. So you're probably thinking, okay, you're a dentist in Connecticut. What motivates you to go 2,000 miles due north, be in a frigid area, freeze your butt off, right, the whole time long, to study a whale that you may or may not see, get funding from institutions that you may come back and say, I got nothing accomplished this particular season. So what would motivate me, right? So I started being interested in dental anthropology, studying the teeth of humans in different areas of the world, and then I started putting different animal examples in the talks. And once I stuck narwhal in there, I realized this animal doesn't make any sense. And then, to boot, I started thinking about how it was perceived, and the tusk particularly, because everyone had relegated it to a mechanism for defense, that this was males duking it out for the female. And, you know, I thought, this is just too odd and too extraordinary, and it seems like there's a better story. So I've spent the last 24 years trying to say and tell a better story. So here's a couple of things about this tusk that you should understand right from the start. First, it's the only straight tusk in nature. Think about all the other tusks, walrus, warthog, whatever. They all have a curvature to them, only straight one, only spiral tusk. The list gets longer. So for dimorphism, which is the difference between males and females, in every other mammalian species, you would expect roughly the same size and the same shape of the teeth. Could be a little bit difference in size between males and females, but most of the time they'd be pretty much the same. If you look at narwhal, most males have the tusk. It typically erupts from the left side. Some males don't have a tusk. Most females don't have a tusk. 15% or so do have a tusk. Some males have two tusks, small percentage, and in an odd way, some females can also have two tusks. But if you look at the average difference between a male and a male will have a tusk, typically 8 to 9 feet long, on the left side, by the way, never on the right alone, always on the left. And you have to think the females typically don't have any tusk. That's about as different as you can possibly get in one species. Then you look at the shape. So the spiral comes out as a left-handed spiral or counterclockwise. In the example, when there are two tusks, that spiral is also a left-handed spiral. In every other species on the planet, it's the mirror image. It would be a right-handed spiral. This is the only example in nature where this occurs. Only example where the sexual dimorphism occurs. Only example, straight tusk and spiral tusk. Why? Why did the Creator have this on the planet? And by the way, for those of you who think, well, Darwin had the answer, or Linnaeus, both of them scratched their heads. They did not have a good explanation for narwhal. Narwhal was put in the little bag on the side after everybody else was done, and they got kind of lumped in to what was called a secondary sexual characteristic, which interestingly enough, in my first conversation with one of my mentors, Jim Mead at the Smithsonian, who I also say hello to, by the way, he looked at me and he said, oh, I thought it was a secondary sexual characteristic, like the peacock feather or the lion mane. And I looked at him without even thinking, And I said, and nobody knows what those do either. And he was stunned, I think, by my response. And I was stunned, because sometimes I just come out with stuff without thinking. But I realized in hindsight, I went to a luncheon at National Geographic, and I told them this story. And they said, you know, interesting you mentioned the lion mane, because we have somebody studying lion manes, and they've discovered that they come in different colors, and they come in different lengths. And that if a lion loses a fight within the pride, he loses his mane. And if he regains his stature in the pride, the mane grows back. Now that's a whole different story. So the other aspects about this whale, which are kind of stunning too. So you think of this tusk, and we talked about this with some of the scouts earlier, that everyone kind of conceives of this tusk coming out at a longitudinal angle in line with the body of the whale. It doesn't. It's like 5 degrees off to the left, and it also points downward. So imagine you're a sailor with your rudder 5 degrees off, and you're trying to go straight. These whales have to actually go out of their way to swim fast and straight. And when you're being chased by a killer whale, that becomes a pretty important factor. So again, you have to think from an evolutionary standpoint, why? Now, teeth come in all size, shapes, and although we kind of think of them as passive objects, we're going to learn a little bit more today about exactly what goes on. So there's a whole body of literature that defines the morphology or shape and size of teeth in coordination with their diet. This is a jaw from an anglerfish. It's pretty obvious that if you're a fish swimming in that thing, you're probably not getting out too easily. And then you have this fish, a hammerfish, which chews mollusks. So these teeth are very adaptive for their diet, right? So here we now switch to the narwhal. We're going to look at its tooth. Now, this is a graph of all teeth of toothed whales. Clearly, there's one that does not belong on the graph, right? In fact, not only does it not belong on the graph, we had to actually do it to size in comparison. So again, you have to think like, why? And this, by the way, is the compelling reason and reasons for me being so interested in this tooth. So let's look at its diet. I know some of you who have been through the exhibit have fed the little dish there that has all the narwhal food, so you might already be up on its diet, but this is the narwhal diet. It eats some pretty big fish. You know, Arctic cod, Greenland halibut. So naturally, based on the literature that we just talked about, with diet being coordinated with tooth morphology, we'd expect a lot of teeth in the mouth, right? Here is the narwhal mouth. This makes a lot of sense, right? Let's have no teeth to bite and chew our food. That's the best way to handle this. Instead, let's grow a 9-foot projection out in the middle of the Arctic Ocean that pierces through our upper lip, must cause us tremendous discomfort, gets in the way of swimming. That's a much better way to go about life. Now, there's not a lot of evolutionary history about the narwhal either. You know, these are a couple of relatives, Bohaskia, which was named after one of the curators at the Smithsonian. And we have another curious creature here called Odobenecetops. And this lived off the coast of Peru about 50 million years ago, had 2 tusks, and we actually did some micrographs of it, which we'll show later. This is the closest relative to the narwhal, the beluga. Happy they're all talking about us, right? Oh, let me go back to this guy. Here's another whale. This would be my second favorite choice in the adaptation of teeth and whales. This is a strap-tooth whale. Lives off the coast of New Zealand and Australia, has only 2 teeth in its lower jaw that completely encircle the upper jaw, preventing it from opening its mouth. Okay, so there's another great example of how your teeth can help you through life, right? I often tell people, I think whales just kind of missed the evolutionary boat, right? It was there at the dock. They tried to get on, didn't happen. They were kind of stuck there. So this is where narwhal distribution is, mostly in the Canadian Arctic. I know it shows it all through the Russian side. There are very few there, even upper parts of Norway in the high Arctic. There are roughly 170,000 on the planet. They're protected, they're not endangered. It's a sustainable population that's hunting. This is actually one of my favorite photographs because it shows you the magnitude of really kind of where you are. And I'm actually in this picture, sitting on that sledge if you were able to blow it up. But this is the magnitude. There's a glacier obviously right above us, and the water is in the foreground, which you can't see. And full of wonder, right? These are polar bears, the masters of the environment. These are the animals you don't mess around with. Polar bears, interestingly enough, if we have time, we'll do a story about polar bears, but I'm going to rifle through the rest of this a little bit faster. But if we have time, we'll talk about the difference. And although traditionally the Inuit had gone out with dog sleds, now they're pretty much going out with snowmobiles and ice sledges. This is in Greenland, this is in Qaanaaq, where they still use a lot of traditional methods for hunting and also getting on the ice. So they still use a lot of these traditional ice sledges and dog teams. I love this picture because when I was starting this work at Harvard and I would go into people's laboratories and they would say, oh, you know, why don't you use this instrument and you can plug this in and do this. And then I would pull this slide out and I would say, this is my lab. This is where I work. So we had to adapt quite a bit of both the machinery that we used and even something as minor as suction cups. Believe it or not, there's a whole division at Woods Hole that just deals with suction cups on whales, whole division. It matters what material it's made out of, how long the suction cup is likely to stay on the whale. This is a dry shipper for genetic samples. Doesn't seem likely that you would need a dry shipper in the middle of the high Arctic. It's cold enough, right? But there were degrees of level of colder that we needed. So all kinds of scientific equipment has and continues to be brought up there to bring back samples. I wanted to say a shout out to the Broad Institute and Zoonomia Consortium, which I'm a part of, which we have completed the reference genome for the narwhal, as well as with the frozen zoo, a cell line for narwhal. And these are some of the early anatomic plates we were doing. We did this in combination with Johns Hopkins and the National Institute of Health. We did CT scans, very elaborate ways of doing these kinds of anatomical plates so we could follow the form leads to function routine that so many scientists work with. And lots of stories about how you sneak in a narwhal at the National Institutes of Health. We won't go into that. That was a fun routine. Narwhals, by the way, stink. So we were doing this at like 2 and 3 in the morning, and since patients were going to be there the next morning, it was like, how do you get rid of a narwhal at 3 in the morning and its underlying smell? I don't think we could do that today, actually. These are other plates we created to get a better idea of the variation of the teeth, to understand the embedded tooth that stays in the skull. If you see the one on the right there with the 2 embedded tusks, that's a typical female, and the one on your left showing the erupted tusk and the non-erupted tusk. And then so people start to think, well, why just one tusk typically, you know? And theories have, you know, evolved into multiple ideas of, for example, when I showed you Odobenecetops, living off the coast of Peru 50 million years ago, was likely freshwater where prey are more evenly distributed. And in the high Arctic, prey are not evenly distributed. It's all asymmetric, and this asymmetry might help as a probe to detect that location. That has been one theory that has been put out. That's on the upper right is Dr. Fred Eichmiller, who was the former director of the Paffenberger Research Institute at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And when Fred had come out on several trips with me, by the way, and he had left the directorship of NIST at this lab, and he said, the only study I've taken with me is yours. He said, because I still want to do this. So we had heard on the ice from several Inuit elders that these tusks could bend, they could wave, they could go back and forth. And we were both looking at each other like, I don't think so. But, we thought, an amusing story. We'll kind of deal with it when the time comes. And lo and behold, when we did hardness and flexibility tests at NIST, this material, narwhal tusk material, was found to be the hardest, most flexible material on the planet ever. Now, it's not the hardest and it's not the most flexible, but in combination, it is the hardest and most flexible material. So then the issue came up, could it be used as a cloning material for dental restorative materials, for example? Because these are characteristics of most materials that are in conflict with each other. Usually if something is very hard, it's not flexible, and vice versa. This had both in extreme, so much in extreme that we estimate that over an 8-foot tusk, a narwhal tusk has the ability to flex and bend 12 degrees in every direction. So indeed, those Inuit hunters who were telling us that this thing waves and goes back and forth were actually right. So this was another kind of test we looked at. We looked at the ratio between mineralized tissue calcium and the non-mineralized portion of tusk and tooth materials. And this elaborate machine does something as a technique called Fourier transform infrared microspectroscopy, which is a huge mouthful, but basically it means that you're shooting these rays at a tusk to detect that ratio. And what we found was, in many ways, this tooth was built inside out, that it was more flexible on the outside. And if you look on that upper right where that red core is, the core of this tooth, right around the pulp, is like an iron rod. It's actually more dense than our enamel. Our teeth are built exactly the opposite. We have typically harder material on the outside, and as you go in, it becomes less dense. And we just came out with a paper just a few months ago in the annual reviews of Animal Biosciences that actually reported these differences so that people could understand this is a tooth that's even built differently than other mammalian teeth. And you can see the rings around on that upper left-hand image, so you understand and can see how the difference between understanding how these different mineral layers respond to this technique and what the tooth is actually showing in its natural form. But this was one of the findings that surprised us the most. So imagine this, we were at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, we're in this laboratory, and National Geographic is actually filming us doing the analysis live. And what they tell me is, and maybe you've heard this before, because these TV crews always crack me up. They go, we're waiting for the aha moment. And interestingly enough, the aha moment was actually happening. And we didn't even realize it while the film team was there. We had to go back and kind of look it back over again. But this is scanning electron microscopy, and this is roughly at about 10,000 power. These are open channels between the outside of the tusk and the inner nerve. And for those of us who understood teeth, we've never seen this before in any mammalian species. You can put this on the only list, by the way. So, in science, we're always reluctant to say, oh, it's the only example, it's the most extreme example, because sure enough, there's somebody in the audience that's going to raise their hand and go, well, what about this? But narwhal is very comfortable with being the only, the most extreme, and this is yet another example. So many of these pores that over an 8-foot tusk, there are roughly 9 to 10 million of these openings. Now, when you look at a narwhal tusk, how many of you have seen a narwhal tusk? I know there's one here in the museum. If you haven't seen it, go into that nature room where they have everything, because there's a tusk there. But when you see them, they're hard, they're rigid, unflexible. The last thing you think of as a tusk is that this thing could bend and flex 12 degrees. And the other thing that you would not understand is that over its full length is a nerve. This is an extrapolated nerve from about a 6 to 7 foot tusk. And it takes an artful Inuit hunter to do this, because I've been around many and finally found one from Greenland who could do it very effectively. And it's really amazing. It's an amazing sight to see, because very few people understand when they look at this thing that it's a fully innervated tooth. So if you remember that Odobenecetops, that creature with the two tusks from Peru that I showed you, their scanning electron micrograph is on the far right. It has the exact same pores. Because it's a historic specimen, all the pores mineralized. So that's why you're seeing those white things where the openings would be. And then on these two other images, you're looking at narwhal tusk with all these openings. These are treated so we can get a better view and estimate of how many of these openings there are. And again, this image on your right was also published in this recent paper that I mentioned in Animal Biosciences to show the link and homologous structure, how similar these two animals were, narwhal and Odobenecetops. This was the first link in microanatomy that had been discovered between these two animals. So when we first came out with the finding of these tubules and the fact that it was capable of sensory function, this caught on like wildfire, literally. We were in pretty much every newspaper around the world. There were NPR stories. I was presenting at a mammal conference in San Diego at the time, and I had no time to go to the conference. I was literally in my hotel room with two phones on two ears, fielding questions from people all around the world. And it was really amazing because this animal, for any of you who follow internet trends, for example, Google has something called Google Trends, which monitors your search terms, right? So Google Trends, before this article came out in the New York Times, I believe it was December 13th, 2005, is not even a blip. And after that paper came out, literally within 2 weeks, it almost went off their graph. It was the most searched term on Yahoo. It was the second most popular story in the New York Times, and it was the top story for NPR. So everybody kind of followed in line with this, and then everything changed. We had two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Bill Broad do the article. And interestingly enough, when Harvard did the media release on this, Bill Broad responded with one word when they were pitching the story. And that one word was wow. That was it. That's all he sent back. And he told me in a phone call, he said, unless there's a cure for cancer on the weekend, you're going to be the lead story. So there's a lot of preparation that goes into doing studies like this. I went to the San Diego aquarium and was doing work with belugas and surface electrodes because we wanted to see if we could get signaling from both brain activity and heart activity to monitor health signs that these whales might be going through. And then taking some of those applications into the field, which is a whole different matter, right? So that's me in the black dry suit there. The water is a refreshing 36 degrees for those of you who ever care to bathe in the Arctic. And that laboratory you see with the pontoons is a Peter Hauschka original with some effort there. I think I designed the pontoons there after we did the case. But how do you take, I started working with veterinary medical and dental people who said that, these are the units we typically use. And every time I took one of these units out, they failed. And I just thought, I'm done with this. I spend so much time and effort and money. So I took a live generator, put a live wire into the water, which didn't really please a lot of my collaborators there in the first round, but worked with real instruments, medical grade electroencephalograms and electrocardiograms. And that gave us great data. Now, this is just an ancillary story. This was also in this recent paper that we did because very early on, I'm one of the few investigators that works in front of the whale. And one season, for just a brief second, my right leg went numb, and then it came back. It was like your leg went to sleep, but then boom, came right back. And I thought, like, wow, what the heck is going on? So that was one of the years we had the live wire in. I'm looking at the wire. I'm thinking, like, am I too close to the thing? And I had no explanation for it. And then I didn't want to tell the team because I thought, if they think I'm losing a leg out there, they're probably not going to be overly happy with me doing more tests. So I thought, I'm just going to keep it to myself. And then later, I was talking with a guy named Joe Paradiso at MIT's Media Lab. And interestingly enough, they were talking about the experience, and they said, oh my God, what you actually experienced, and I had 2 hydrophones in the water, by the way, completely random and rare event being actually recorded, first time. What whales have the ability to do is that the same way we direct light, like these bulbs are doing, whales can direct sound. The fact that only one leg went numb meant it had to be a very directed sound, which is typically a high frequency sound. The reason why it would resonate is a low frequency sound, but low frequency waves are very wide, and so both your legs would likely go numb. So how do you explain one leg going numb for a brief instance and only affecting one leg? So I brought the file to Woods Hole, had 2 sound experts look at it, and indeed what we found was that this was a recording of an unusual circumstance where whales can direct sound in a very specific way, and my leg was the specific way. So it was a wonderful way to record the experience, and interestingly enough, they're doing sound stages like this now. So for example, with an orchestra, you could take a violin and stick it on the ceiling, or a cello and put it on the door here. So again, some of the work with brain and heart activity. This is the Tusk gasket on the right, and again, some of the receiving medical information on the left. It turned out that the brain activity was too hard to monitor, so we ended up going with the Holter appliance to monitor all the heart activity. And like I said, we got great results. So typically, and I was the first person to record the narwhal heartbeat. That makes me very happy. And we had a small sample, but we had lots of data points. So we had a significant study showing that under high salt circumstances, being exposed to the tusk, that its heart rate went up. We knew it was sensing the difference between fresh water and high salt. This was the cover piece we did. Peter Hauschka actually is one of the authors on this paper. And we did approach this in 5 different ways because we knew we would get a lot of feedback and flack from biologists who would want to hold on to their existing theory. So we had multiple ways of detecting this. Peter's work was more doing the tissue work with this substance P and the CGRP that you see on the lower right. Then we had other groups doing the anatomy. We did genetics. We did multiple prone attacks to really get a clear picture of this being, get this, a sensory organ system. I actually almost had to write another paper because the authors didn't like that being referred to with a tooth. And I told them, look, it's got everything that an organ system has. And it deserves, since it's doing this sensory work. So we finally got that term put in. Albert Einstein said once, the things that count most in life can't be counted. And that couldn't be more true of working with the Inuit. And this is a large study I did over 3 years with the National Science Foundation, interviewing Inuit elders throughout northwestern Greenland and northeastern Baffin Island. Those are James Houston's prints there. This is Cornelius Nutarok, has been called very much the voice of the Arctic. We have his original notes. They will be actually put in the 2nd edition of our book, which has sold out and done very well. Cornelius will be a chapter unto himself. And these are the interviews that I would be conducting. This is Elizabeth P. Ootuva from Pond Inlet, who's the author of the English to Inuktitut Dictionary, a hunter by her own right. This is Pavia Nielsen from Greenland. And all of these hunters have their own story and additive. So for example, this is Jens Jeremiasen from Kanak. We were looking at the migration patterns of the narwhal across the coast of Greenland because the scientists had purported that the populations were dwindling, they were going to cut down their quotas for hunting, and the hunters needed a way to defend themselves in a way. So through another National Science Foundation grant, I was able to get support to bring 2 Greenlandic hunters to present at the Inuit Circumpolar Conference in Alaska, and we eventually turned over this quota about 2 or 3 years later. This is Rasmus Avike, also from Qaanaaq, who was explaining a story when we did an interview about narwhal molting their skin. And I love this because I remember distinctly when scientists were all talking in one of our campsites, the definitive thing they would always say is, we know they're not coming in here to molt. And I love this because Rasmus told me a story. He said the reason why scientists can't see them molting is because they don't do it like beluga with a very thick shedding. Narwhal do it almost with a gauze-like thinness, and if you're not there, you'll never see it. And they do multiples of these. And he said literally, if you're not there, and he had been there with a kayak, it dissipates in seconds. The value, again, of Inuit knowledge. So we constituted a new map for the migration studies, and interestingly enough, about 5 years later, the scientists had discovered roughly the same thing. This was only done on traditional knowledge. It's part of another Smithsonian book. That's Jens Jeremiason from Huna Island. This was the Smithsonian debut with Jane O'Brien from the BBC, and my lovely wife there, flanking on the side, who has also been an ardent supporter and also traveled about 3 times on expeditions and is a hardy one in the Arctic as well. This is the cover of the book that you'll be seeing. This is COVID, for those of you who remember when COVID was having its transmission to animals. There were several binding sites for a receptor. Narwhal, interestingly enough, were second-tier animals compared with the binding sites. This is a little bit more of an advanced slide. We'll move on to this one. Folks like these, lowland gorillas and primates, had all the binding sites of humans, so their populations were threatened and indeed endangered. So a lot of the preserves in Africa, for example, closed. All of these 3 animals, by the way, have had coronavirus, all of them. And the seal on the right in the numbers of 50 to 60,000. So they have had a history. It's not a far-fetched idea. This is a saucid, which is a sudden entrapment from fast ice that they call in the Arctic, which is happening a little bit more with climate change and unpredictable weather patterns. I show this because this is Narwhal HoloLens. We have Meryl Streep narrating. This is at the Smithsonian. I don't know, Carol, if you were at this, but this was good fun. We put lenses on all the exhibits people, and then at the end you become a narwhal. So, and to boot, we actually have a game. So you actually can hunt fish with your tusk, and there's confetti that comes down for the winner. We just resurrected this again in Cleveland about 2 weeks ago. It was good fun. This is also from the experience to show the connection between the nerve and the brain. Again, the legend of Sedna. This is the Inuit legend that all of the animals are trapped in her hair when there's pollution and things that can't untangle her hair so they can swim freely in the ocean. And a project we've been working on most recently with an education module systems with Pamela's Eco Hero program. And also that thing on the top is a mural that's 30 feet by 6 feet that we brought all across the Arctic with Disney Imagineering's Joe Rohde, if any of you know that name. Joe proposed this with me when I offered him to come up, and he said, I want to bring a mural that's 30 feet by 6 feet. I want all these communities. I said, 30 feet by 6 feet, are you serious? And everything in me said no, which was why I said yes. So we did it, and it's become a very unusual art relic that will go along with the modules. This is a video we do not need to play because we're going to run out of time
Some say
soon.
it's used for fencing.
Oh, no need.
Yet these exchanges are too.
I can turn you off. Again, some of the wonderful images. Obviously, it takes a collaborative team. These are all the Inuit elders who typically might help us, and hunters. And I in the back with one of the Explorers Club flags, and typically Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, where we catch and monitor these whales, and I get to do some of the studies. And then this, I think, which is the most kind of iconic picture because it really boils down the whole work. The Inuit, the scientist, and the whale. Thank you very much. So we have time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, so those of you that need to leave, don't worry, but wanted to give folks a chance to ask Dr. Nguyen some questions. And first, just a thank you for such an amazing presentation. So much incredible research that's gone on and the collaboration you've been involved in. So thank you for that.
Well, by the way, we love the energy you've created in this museum. Yeah, you excite people. It's great.
And wanting to check, like, what is the next exciting thing that you want to explore?
Oh, we have super exciting things coming up. One that I can only kind of hint at because it's under embargo probably for about a year and a half. But there, I don't know if I should, I'm not going to fall into the hole. So I'm not going to go there, but it's super exciting. Use your imaginations. The other one is we're working up an albino narwhal. It's a true albino. Typically in the world of nature, especially for whales, there have been albinos reported, but they're not true albinos. This is actually a true albino with a pink eye. We have all the genetics done on it, and I'm working on better understanding the eye itself for this animal because interestingly enough, one of our photographers, and we have a whole fabulous team of photographers, but one, Glenn Williams, had done an incredible shot with a narwhal coming through a lead, and its eyes are almost coming out of its socket. And I told him, I said, can the whale really do that? And he said, oh yeah, their eyes can bulge out. And so I thought, oh, we should really work up the anatomy of the eye. The lens is different. There's quite a few differences in the way this animal perceives its environment visually. But we will do a study of this because obviously with albinism, sight is one of the first things to go. Was trying to do a study on skin cancer too, so, but unfortunately pieces of the whale were not in good enough shape to do a full analysis of that. But that's another exciting venture. And the other is to find out really the evolution of why this thing is really on the planet. You know, what's at the core of this? What's happening here? You know, why does this one not fit? You know, we love it when boxes conveniently, cover our perceptions and understanding of what we study. But, isn't it refreshing? And for those of you who might take a different approach to the origin or the cosmos of life, isn't it refreshing that we have something that doesn't make sense? And good for us to have this animal. It's almost a poster child for creationism, if you want to go there. But I love the fact that from an evolutionary standpoint, nothing I ever learned about in dental school really applies to this animal. And that was really a propelling reason for me to spend so much time with it.
Well, thank you for that. So yes, put up your hand if you're. Oh, sorry. We're going to ask you to take the mic because we're recording this and we're going to post.
Do you want me to repeat the question? Is that easier?
I'm going to repeat that, yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, how did the narwhal react to being touched? I will tell you that most of the biologists who have ever studied whales appreciate and understand that a whale is incredibly gentle when it's around humans. It goes out of its way to get out of your way. Literally, this is a 2-ton animal with a flick of a tail. It could knock our whole team off. I mean, really, if it wanted to, and it doesn't. So it makes you think about the qualities of that animal, right? So in direct answer to your question, we catch them in nets where they do put up a fight because naturally no one's excited about being in a net. But once they're on shore, unlike belugas, for example, they're very docile. And once you hold their tusk, interestingly enough, they become completely docile. There's hardly any movement, which I also found interesting.
So I had a question when you were talking about what happened to your leg. Do they use that when they're feeding to stun their food?
Yeah, I believe they do. So for those of you who saw there was World Wildlife video that went a little viral about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It showed narwhals kind of flicking their tusks and then having food come in. And the theory was that the tusk was actually doing something that was involved with stunning the fish. And I and another investigator looked at the video under high magnification, and we didn't think that's what was happening. We thought the fish were actually being stunned before the tusk contact, and that's what I still believe. I think you can't go flicking this thing around all day long to eat, especially if you're a whale. So I believe they have the ability and they have the cooperative sense as mammals to use this ability to stun to stun fish, because you have to keep in mind that most of these fish can dodge a whale, right? They can swim faster in many ways, so you have to think of another mechanism. So that would be the answer.
Okay. I was wondering, are they born with part of a tusk? And how does the tusk grow over its lifespan?
So you can imagine if they had the tusk at birth, it might be a difficult birth, but like us, their tusk doesn't really start to erupt between 1 year and 2 years. So that's when it starts to form, if it's going to erupt. And like I mentioned, typically on the left side, never an example on the right.
Hello, I'm curious if you understand the mechanism of how the whale sound stuns fish. And I'm also curious of your thoughts of why it directed the sound at your leg.
So I think a couple of things. I think it directed it at my leg because I was the perceivable object that was holding it in its place. Everybody else was on the side. And I think its directed sense is from its skull and its head. And since I'm the closest thing to that, I'm the one that would have the most likely effect. In terms of a deeper mechanism, I don't have that for you, but I do know that the high frequency sound can carry the low frequency resonance ability which caused the stunning. So it's the high frequency that gives it the direction, it's the low frequency that caused the resonance.
I thought your comments regarding sexual dimorphism were really interesting in the sense that it seems like tusk development is not evenly distributed across the population. Like there's a lot of irregularity.
Exactly.
Would that make you think that there's some level of developmental plasticity at play with respect to whether or not tusk development occurs, or do you think it's catalyzed?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer at this point. I will tell you that I didn't mention also in the talk, this whale has the ability to form 16 teeth in its mouth, and it genetically silences them at birth. So it even has the ability to have teeth in its mouth, and again, something in the evolutionary DNA says, no, I don't need that. I don't need teeth to chew. I'd much rather have the big probe. It really is counterintuitive on almost every level.
Hi, that was fascinating, thank you. And 2 questions. One, because that whole tooth is innervated, and when I think about if I drink something really cold and I've got a tooth, that sensitivity, are you able to measure sort of the pain that might create for them?
Well, unless someone does the Narwhal to English dictionary, I don't.
Right.
But there are investigators actually working on that. So that may be a point where we get to. But certainly in the perception of what teeth have, we know they have pain fibers, right? C fibers, we have those. And they also have sensory A fibers. That's going to give you the differentiation in things like cold, for example. And these whales have it, all mammals have it. In fact, the very evolution of teeth really began as sensory systems. So this is not a far-flung concept. And I think now to apply how evolution took this direction and put it in different pathways is the larger question, right? So why did everyone else go a different way, and why did whales decide to go this way, right? So, but I think they can teach us a lot. The sensory work, it was interesting. There was a Swedish investigator by the name of Martin Brandstrom who did this hydrodynamic theory of teeth, which basically hypothesized that there was this system between the outer environment and you that created this perception. And interestingly enough, salt water, the fluid in these tubules where you see these openings, which is called hydrostatic fluid, and blood plasma that flows in you, pretty much all the same stuff. There's almost actually a 98 to 99% similarity between all those mediums. And I always tell people, for 9 months of your life, you're a marine mammal, right? You're swimming in salt water, you are, until you're born.
If I could, just the second part was, you said something about how they go quiet when you are touching the tusk.
Yeah.
And you made that, I instantly thought of sharks and the ampullae, I forget exactly what they're called, but on the front of their head, of their face, if you touch that, they go into tonic immobility. Immobility. So do you think it's a similar mechanism, possibly?
I don't know. I don't think it's a similar mechanism, but I think it has similarities. Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for the talk. Really fascinating. When I first started reading a lot of your research, 10 years ago, middle school, I remember reading a lot about how the tusk was used for environmental stimuli sensing, and how it might be used to detect changes in things like pH and temperature and salinity in the water, but that a lot of that stuff was still really being currently researched. What kind of developments have you found in the last 10 years or so in that kind of regards?
So the hard thing, first of all, thank you for being such a devout reader of the work. The question always arises, which is an interesting adjunct to your question, is if this is for survival, why don't all females have it, for example? Why isn't this evenly distributed in the population? And my response to that always first is, I'm trying to figure out why anybody would want this thing, right? So, but second to that would be, we have to realize in science, when we make a discovery or we have an insight, it's a blink of an eye, right, in evolution. We got 4.5 billion years. Who are we to make the conclusion based on our time, in our lifetime, about an overall perception that's going to affect either that animal or our lives? And so one of the things we did in the paper that you saw from the anatomical record was we put out multiple ideas about how to conceptualize this. And one of them was, look, we don't have the benefit of having a great evolutionary picture, as I showed. You don't have a lot. It's not like the elephant where you just can see every different form of the elephant throughout history. So to put that together in a reasonable way, you could also say, is this a sensory organ system that's being phased in or being phased out? It doesn't happen during my lifetime, and I don't have the benefit of looking at historic populations to find out. This becomes an interesting quandary, but we do know that its primary function is sensory. This whale has clearly gone out of its way to perceive its environment. I mean, it's just stunning when we saw the tubules and we saw the reaction. And we're with very high power people who look at teeth all day long, and they were equally stunned. So to even have that as a record, we used salinity because it was an easy, reproducible way to work. You don't have the luxury of catching these whales all the time. You don't have the luxury of finding a good way of detecting how you monitor the signs of the whale to detect what the stimulus is doing. But in hindsight, it was great. Martin Brandstrom, when he did this, sensory thing, they were doing work with cats. And I thought, like, God, could you have picked a worse animal to do sensory studies on teeth? So I actually thought narwhal would be a super example, and I still think so, for showing this hydrodynamic theory is actually correct.
Well, how about one more question? Do you want to, there was something here? Yeah, did you want?
Yeah, well, as you were talking about the fact that not all of them have it, do you know what the proportion of the population is that does have it?
That does so roughly, yeah, I could make an estimated guess,
Yeah.
because I've seen thousands of these whales, but I would say roughly over 95% of males have the tusk. Of those, roughly probably 5 to 10% have two tusks. So, and roughly a small percent, maybe like 2 or 3%, have no tusk. In females, the purported number in the literature is 15% have tusks. Most of them, if you're looking at the other 85, do not have tusks. And some females, very rare, maybe a percent at the most probably, have two tusks.
Do we know what the females are doing to make up for it, for not having it?
We don't know, but keep in mind, they're mammals, they talk to each other, so there's no reason why, the person who's got the great antenna can't radio to everybody. I mean, that's what we do, right? We tune in, we don't have our sensory thing for weather, we tune into the guy that's paying attention and we go, okay, we'll follow you. And it's interesting that I bring up that example because people all the time tell me about the saucet, and the whales that get trapped because, sometimes hundreds of whales get trapped in these things. And they say, well, if they're sensory organs, why would they get trapped? Why wouldn't they be able to predict this? And I always tell them, well, if the Katrina hurricane came and you guys didn't respond in time and, hundreds of thousands of people were trapped, doesn't sound like your sensory systems work so great either, right? So we all have these abilities, but we all have limits to what, they can do and detect, so.
Well, thank you. That's actually a great question to end on because it brings us right back in focus with the tusk and the fact that there's limits to what we can know and what so much more to be discovered. Martin, you're going to be out available to sign books and also to answer more questions in the lobby. And thank you so much again for coming all the way here and sharing all this with us. Certainly, I learned things too. And thank you all for coming in today and joining us in the foray of learning more about narwhal. Thank you again.
This is great. So before we go, I just want you to entertain me for 1 sec. As part of Narwhal Nation, we should do a photo. I will be in the foreground, you will be in the background, but I would like you to be tusked, preferably with your left hand. If you choose to be a double tusk, you can do that.